Hey there, and welcome to the Muckcast, a cozy listen to pair with your coffee. I'm Hannah, the writer behind Hug in a Mug or Hannah's Cafe on Medium, where I cover everything from music to psychology as a woman living abroad. Here I read my stories aloud with a few fresh reflections and insights along the way. So grab your mug, settle in, and let's get into today's piece. I think you can notice that compared to the last episode, I've changed a few things. Mainly the reason being that for the past months, I kept pushing out to record a podcast episode again, simply because I was living in a dorm with several other girls and it was hard to get a quiet moment. And the whole setup with the mic and editing and also trying to turn it into video podcast on YouTube was just a little bit too much. And I realized that rather than making a really high quality video podcast that I can't keep up, maybe I should go back to the basics and literally just record this for everybody to listen to, because really that's the idea that I'm coming from. I want to also read my articles, not just because I want to give them a bigger platform and I want to help other people reach these articles, but mainly also because I think I can add a little more depth if I'm talking about them rather than just writing them. And so, yeah, I'm back after months and months of a break. And also, this will be a one take. I'm trying this for the first time. It's probably going to be embarrassing. I'm very sorry. And if it is too embarrassing, this will probably never reach online, but I'm trying to keep it real here. Okay, today's piece is The Sound of Feminism in Musicals, the vocal magic of Wicked, and I've specifically gone into the vocal movements and register changes that happen during Wicked. It goes beyond Elphaba's defying gravity, and I will explain the whole world of feminist theory that lies in the sound and vocals and storytelling of Wicked. Recently, I've treated myself to a feminist-inspired audible gift, a ticket to Wicked, the musical in Busan, South Korea, which is where I'm currently at. I will not lie, I was mesmerized by this musical masterpiece yet again. I loved the songs, the acting, and the stage design, of course. Most of all, I was over the moon to hear these pieces sung live, which basically guarantees a highway of shivers down my spine. Also, the heartthrob from Defying Gravity and No Good Deed and the battle cries at the end, paired with the teary-eyed ending of For Good, it all certainly didn't disappoint. In the process of indulging my drum fur into some well-deserved female-made vibrations, I marveled over how well not just the storyline and the lyrics flow, but that the expert usage of the female voice adds a whole level of depth to this musical. With a bit of theory on the female vocal capacities in mind, the character transformation of Elphaba, but especially the one of Glinda, becomes not just visible but palpable. Afterwards, I spend several hours deep listening into these vocal lines again and again while I identified their specific register changes. This revealed a whole other level beneath the melodies, which is quite intriguing once decrypted, and I'm sure fellow musical lovers would also like to discover this somewhat obscured and hidden messaging of the musical. So, this is why here I'm diving deep into how voices of Wicked tell a story without using words. For some basics, I will start this article off with a few basic assumptions we can level the playing field a little bit and so I can make my further statements a little easier to grasp. There will be some technical terminology that vocal coaches like to use to help students mimic feelings, character, and intentions of their roles more accurately. First of all, my main ideas are based on the structure of chest voice, head voice, and mixed voice. Otherwise, these are referred to as vocal registers. And common vocal techniques of pop singing will also be included in the article, but there won't be too many, so you don't have to worry about getting lost. I've explained these three principles already in a previous article, where I also dive in the transformation of the female voice in pop music, alongside the history of the waves of feminism. If these terms are completely new to you, you can reference that article, which I've also recorded in a previous podcast episode. But fundamentally, there's one simple equation that Wicked is playing with vocally throughout the entire musical, and it is the contrast and duality between femininity and masculinity, or in terms of psychology, anima and animus, or in terms of vocal terminology, the chest and head register. The equation goes as follows. The chest voice, the deeper, richer, and more powerful one, lends itself to telling stories of empowered women, of strength, strain, and persistence, especially when paired with belting and riffs. The head voice, which sounds breathier, softer, and frankly, usually higher, is often used for softer characters to exemplify the sound of femininity or questioning, to add some audible glitter or sweetness, and it is often paired with a soft vibrato or some more breathy sounds. There's also the third one, the mixed voice, which adds facets to these two counterparts, depending on where the transition of the vocal line is coming from and moving towards, in terms of notes and in terms of storytelling, that is. So at this point, I want you to take a guess at who, Elphaba or Glinda, according to what I just said, lives in which register. I think it's pretty easy to tell, but I'm going to give you the answer in a few seconds. Even though this is a very simple, basic assumption, Wicked doesn't stop at that. It does a remarkable job at playing with deeper female complexity, in my opinion. And all of that while the men in the story are mostly singing about slothing around or literally dancing through life in the easiest way possible. Simultaneously, another man doesn't even apologize for being self absorbed, so much so as to trick an entire nation and use the argument of being a sentimental man as an apology because he thinks of himself as so wonderful. Ain't that sound familiar? Now for the resolution for the question I asked earlier. Elphaba is the strong chest voice. As mentioned, Elphaba's main vocal quality is her chest register, giving her the sound necessary for clarity and determination to be embedded in her character. Even in her first piece, The Wizard and I, she starts in an optionally, and this might differ a little bit across different actors and different versions of the play, a more questioning mixed voice. And then she turns into a slightly more airy tone, but quickly she uses the ascending lines to step into the determined and unapologetic chest voice. Especially the battle cry at the end of The Wizard and I, which repeats across Elphaba's songs a lot and gets stronger and stronger across each of her solo performances, is her first time to shine fully in her chest register. The battle cry, which is technically the ending riff of most of her songs, is sometimes only discussed in Defying Gravity, but actually it's a persistent characteristic of Elphaba's onstage appearances throughout the entire musical. So if you want to characterize the battle cry, one could say it's her audible signature. It seems the lady can never leave without imprinting a lasting vibration on a roaring live audience, which is the precise characteristic that makes her one of the most sought-after female roles in singing in musical history. Most of Elphaba's songs start more reserved and move further and further towards vocal techniques like roars or belting towards the end, signaling to the listener that while she might enter the stage slightly unsure, by the end of the song, she knows exactly what she's doing. This is a defining feature that makes Defying Gravity feel so well-rounded as a centerpiece. Plus, Defying Gravity has a higher vocal strain with just enough freedom for each of the actors to show individuality, especially during the battle cry at the very end. Defying Gravity starts in unisono with a fight between Glinda and Elphaba, and it continues to move into several long-held intervals where between the two of them, Elphaba always holds the grounded and lower note, and Glinda takes the slightly questionable higher one, or questioning higher one. She also does so earlier in an argument with Glinda during the song What Is This Feeling, which is one of my personal favorites, making her sound like the more reasonable of the two fighters. So in taking on the lower note, Elphaba kind of proves that she's the more stable between the two. Finally, after having determined that she and her friend will have to part ways in Defying Gravity, she steps fully into belting from her chest register and ends on the infamous battle cry riff. Now, at this point, if you're looking at the Medium article that I wrote for this, there's an embed here of a YouTube video which has a lot of different Elphaba battle cries. So for those who either don't know this battle cry or can't get enough of it. If you're looking for a morning alarm or something that truly motivates the witch in you, this YouTube video is a compilation of many, and I want to emphasize many different Elphaba battle cries because the video takes about 9 minutes and it only summarizes the battle cries that are only a few seconds long, so there's a lot to choose from. So if you want to go find your favorite Elphaba, go ahead, click at the link to the article, and you will find the YouTube video. The only time that Elphaba shows softness, despite still rarely moving into her head register, are during the little intermezzos of Unlimited, which always functions as a vocal transition for her. She gets to step into a softer tone, and she adds some more airiness to her voice, which functions as almost a vocal reflection time, so you can feel or hear that she's kind of thinking herself out of the situation. She steps back, and this enables her to come back into the rest of the piece with much stronger melodies and stronger vocal contrast than it would have been if they completely skipped the Unlimited part. So Unlimited is basically a moment of dipping down the entire intensity of the moment, and then by bringing it down, Defying Gravity can come up much higher and much more intense after. Another moment of breathiness in her voice is audible during I'm Not That Girl, where the vocal lines stay very low, which doesn't lend itself to belting very well. Due to the extremely low last note of the chorus, the song manages to maintain a vocal quality with reflective accents, with not too many embellishments as well, while forcing the singer to brush more air through the vocal folds as they admit to not being that girl, which audibly hints at sadness or remorse. So this song basically creates a very remorseful, sad, and reflective air by using these lower notes, which require more openness in the vocal folds and more softness. The perfect summary of Elphaba's vocal personality happens in No Good Deed. She gets into it with a questioning tone, but already in rage, as she looks for the spell in her spellbook, with the anger adding to her chest register presence. There is, of course, a signature riff at the end of the song as well, which I love, but also a moment of head voice as she calls for Fiyero for the first time, which quickly, oh my god, what was that? Quickly? With the actual, okay, which quickly, upon repetition, gets reassured and turned into a belt. If you were to ask me for my favorite Elphaba song, honestly, I love Defying Gravity, but I also love to be the person who doesn't love what everybody else loves. So on my stupid uniqueness quest here, I will say No Good Deed is actually my favorite Elphaba song because it is so strong. Like her vocal presence in that song is so strong. Now for the second of the two, Glinda. Vocal puns and lying in falsetto magic. Considering the fame of Elphaba's riffs and vocals, it is actually sad that Glinda's voice receives far less attention, despite it being actually quite intriguing if analyzed deeply. Generally, Glinda is, as in every other capacity, like color or visuals or personality or background, the complete opposite of Elphaba in terms of voice. She sounds breathy, airy, giggly with lots of vibratos. She quirkily floats around in her head register with some mixing in case of lower notes, and that makes her sound quite literally nosy. The reason that I think Glinda is disregarded is that one of the best and most telling pieces she's singing, which is No One Mourns the Wicked, is set at the very beginning of the piece, giving the audience little time to look forward to it. But if you have already seen the musical once and are reviewing it, you might discover the ingenuity hidden in the song. Technically, in terms of timeline, the piece happens at the very end after For Good, and Elphaba's supposed death is where, if you were to restructure the story chronologically, so this is where you would put it at the very, very end. To understand the depth and maturing process of her voice, Glinda's voice here, It is important to keep this timeline in mind because For Good, in that same vein, is actually the moment where Glinda has learned her voice the best. So, on the other hand, Glinda's youngest voice is featured during Dear Old Shiz, which is like a smaller piece at the beginning or at the transition from No One Mourns the Wicked to like moving back in time. This is where she introduces herself with a very breathy climb up and ends on a very dramatic vibrato, which sets the scene for her whole personality. And this emphasizes from the start that she's one to show off, also vocally. But at this point, she's still playing the role of the unsure teenager. She giggles and she wiggles in her insecurities, yet pretends to be almighty and high in pitch, which you can literally hear. She proves this role during What Is This Feeling? Again, one of my favorite songs in the piece, where she jumps back and forth between chest and head register, depending on who she's talking to, and this is very intriguing. If she sings at Elphaba in anger, in an argument, she uses a more true sounding chest voice. But as she writes to her parents in the letter, or as she sings to the crowd of followers as she addresses them, she intentionally switches to the head voice and overuses embellishments. This register choice shows something intriguing about Glinda's vocal usage that is to be highlighted. When she speaks her truth, she falls, almost as if accidentally, maybe because of emotions that she cannot process yet, into her chest register. She falls into the register that seems true and grounded and maybe a little bit angry. But when speaking to others to impress or to represent herself in some sort of way, she sings in a high head register or even a falsetto with vibrato, always using her nostrils as an additional sound body and for her characteristic timbre before a far reaching vibrato. So I think the part about the nostrils, using the nostrils as a sound body, is specifically interesting because, of course, this differs across singers. They all have um, a different sound, and that sound is partially how they use their vocal folds, how much they use it as a muscle, how much airiness and breathiness they give it, how they interpret the character. But it also is there's an anatomical feature to this. How the voice vibrates in your body is just different on different people with different anatomical structures. And some have a greater capacity to use their nostrils area as kind of a vibration area. Imagine it like a guitar. Some people can if the guitar has a sound body, and much like that, you have different sound bodies in your face that singers like to use. And for Glinda's role, the nose area is kind of where you, at least if you imagine the character to be this kind of overly impressive person, then that's where you want to aim for your voice to sit, kind of high, of course. It is this play of registers that allows Glinda and her character to jump between the truths and the lies, which is so important in this piece. And if you listen closely, I bet you can figure out where she lies intentionally merely by listening, whether she's in falsetto or very heavily airy vibratos or in her head register. The register changes are really what gives her away as a liar sometimes. And if the battle cry is Elphaba signature, then the seemingly useless la 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 passages, I'm gonna be so embarrassed for this la la la, in every of her solo appearances, from Popular to No One Mourns the Wicked to Goodness Knows, those la la las are Glinda's vocal identifier. They are sprinkled in to give her a moment to shine because she can climb up and down as much as she wants to. They are there to enchant the audience with her ever climbing heavily nasal and richness and vibrato that almost hurts. And they are there intentionally because it almost seems hilarious and overdone. But that's the beauty of that. The moment is actually hard to sing. It sounds pretentious. It has no lyrics, which means there's just sound, no deeper context, no deeper meaning. And this mirrors Glinda's personality perfectly. Higher effort, high maintenance, but she's also kind of essentially fake. Which, by the way, doesn't make these lines that Glinda is singing any easier to do, but it kind of is the story of her life, that she's not an easy person, and her life is also kind of hard by nature of being a little bit pretentious. Instead of growing more stable during the entire story, she learns to use her lies by using her head voice with time. In Popular, she's also still younger, but she's kind of gained this maturity of having this newfound friendship with Elphaba. So she's now a little bit more intentional around her head voice, but it's still a bit quirky. She still jumps register almost randomly sometimes, seemingly unplanned and awkward, which gives her, in this piece, gives her this essentially humorous sound. The second Popular in every single line starts in a chest voice, then jumps into the head voice very suddenly and very quickly falls back into the chest register immediately after. And this creates this interesting cranky chicken like sound. I don't know how else to explain it, but a little bit weird. And it sounds pretentious, performative, which the entire show of Popular is. And in my humble opinion, and I know people disagree on this, but I think no one performs the cringiness of this song better than Ariana Grande, as she literally sweeps the floor in her self indulgence. Yes, it hurts intentionally. And then at some point, you start loving it. And then at some point, trust me, you're getting trapped in it and you start loving Popular. It's one of those songs where you're like, on the first listen, you're like, this is odd and this is cringy. And the more you listen to it, the more you get insanely addicted. So at this point in the article, if you click on the link to the Medium article, you will find the video of Ariana Grande's um, Popular performance. But of course, again, people have different opinions on whether that's the best Glinda or another is the best Glinda. I really don't want to get into that debate because I think this is way too hot of a debate than necessary. It's all art, friends, and everybody's allowed to love what they love. Other times, Glinda's chest voice, and thus arguably her true intentions, the moments where she's not lying, are audible in the play during Not That Girl. This is when she realizes Fiyero chooses Elphaba over her. And so she kind of is forced as well in this piece to go a little bit lower, a little bit more reflective, and a little less shiny, high vibrato head voice. The second example of her chest voice usage is for good, when she even takes the lower of the two notes in interval song with Elphaba. Again, remember, usually Elphaba sings the lower note, but in this time she sings the higher one. She sings the higher one, and Glinda gets the lower one, showing her progression from always high pitched and show off to grounded and clear. And now, with all this information, thank goodness, which is at the beginning but should be at the end, remember, becomes a whole lot more nuanced. As she sings about her engagement with Fiyero, she stays very much breathy and pretentious up until the appearance of the following line. There's a kind of a sort, she sings, there's a kind of a sort of cost. There are a couple things that get lost. There are bridges you didn't know you crossed until you crossed. Which is again one of the few passages where she sings fully in her chest register, with a long note held at the end of every passage, which is uncharacteristically straight for her, no vibratos. After that, she repeats the phrase, happy is what happens when all your dreams come true. But despite the lyrics, the melody either forces her voice down at the end, making it sound more like a question, or it is so high that the fake head register is being used. And in one incident, the choir jumps in before she finishes the sentence, and these three incidents kind of all mark that this is actually a lie. Finally, a lot could be said about No One Mourns the Wicked, the one that is at the very beginning but should come at the very, 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 very end. But I've picked two special passages as examples to show you how you can pick out when Glinda is lying. The first one is, she sings, "Isn't it nice to know that good will conquer evil? That's true we all believe in, by and by." That's where her voice climbs up. "Outlive a lie," climbs up again. "For you," and climbs up, but the choir interrupts her. This passage is indicative of Glinda hiding lies behind the highest notes. As the longer she lies to the people, the higher her voice gets, and kind of impossibly high at the end. Eventually, her line is broken before hitting the highest note, and before having to say something about herself in the sentence, the choir jumps in. This could be understood as her tangling herself in her own lies, until the point where she literally can't speak those lies anymore. And it speaks to her growing disbelief in her own words. The second phrase from the song is as follows: Goodness knows the wicked's lives are lonely. Goodness knows the wicked die alone. It just shows when you're wicked, you're left only on your own. This passage is repeated twice, once sung by Glinda, and the second time it's sung by the choir, who is already indoctrinated with her message, interestingly. And thus, Glinda is merely falsetto echoing above the choir, which is her biggest moment to shine, I think, and the most overlooked because it's at the very beginning. She kind of acts like a bubble floating conductor, orchestrating all of her followers, basically the inhabitants of Munchkinland. Despite that, when Glinda sings "You're left only on your own" in the first repetition, there's a very small detail that is interesting, because the line should be ending on a big terz. She doesn't end in the major interval, the big terz, at the end, but she jumps into a minor, small terz, which leaves her voice sounding very questioning, gives the moment a sound of trailing off, as if she's left in thought, and as if she's going into the memories that she has of Elphaba and Fiero and her for just a split second before the choir takes her back into the real moment. And finally, we've got to talk about one thing that I think the movie did well, and I think we can't disagree on that one, which is The Girl in the Bubble. Because in the movie version, there is the song The Girl in the Bubble, which I will admit I personally cried bitter tears over when I heard this for the first time. Not only does it reflect beautifully and yet painstakingly well the internal conflict of choosing between social expectations and femininity as a woman, which is a little play at the Madonna whore complex or dichotomy by Freud, but we're not going into that right now. It also plays with all of the vocal facets that we know and love from Glinda, and it gives her that well-deserved moment to shine all by herself, which in the musical version she doesn't get. There's not a piece where she gets to stand by herself and where we hear her as fully speaking her truth, because she's not surrounded by followers, and where we get to hear her use her voice in such expertise without the pretentious nature to it. As the viewer receives more insights into Glinda's background during The Girl in the Bubble, the listener can indulge into jumping registers, the embellishments of a very demanding melody, and many, many high jumps. This song specifically positions itself as a contrast to Popular, I would say, where the naive voice weirdly and pretentiously flops up and down. But in The Girl in the Bubble, each amazing vocal jump sounds very practiced, very intentional, very artistic. The lines go well with each of the words that she's saying and the meaning behind them and how it resonates with female viewers, I would assume. Despite it still being a very soft and glittery sounding song, it showcases a lot of hurt and pain and depth. And specifically, it helps underline the many facets of Glinda. So, on the whole, Wicked plays with audible contrast, and it's not just the contrast between pink and green. The biggest achievement of Wicked, in my eyes, is not the orchestration and not the storytelling, though I will say those are amazing. Those are the reasons I kept going back to it. But the more I looked into it, to me, it is the vocal lines that allow the actors to trace how two women are growing alongside each other, not just in story, but also audibly and sonically, which makes Wicked great. To better feel the patterns I've explained, I recommend listening to the pieces in the musical in the following pairings, and that kind of shows the character development from young to mature in both Elphaba and Glinda. The pairings I recommend is for Elphaba, I would advise you to listen to The Wizard and I, immediately followed by No Good Deed, which shows a moving from unsure or mistrust to trust, and then from fury to power. For Glinda, the pairing is Popular and The Girl in the Bubble. Popular, the naive, pretentious, multifaceted character, and The Girl in the Bubble, the soft, understanding voice with sadness, melancholy, and vocal excellence. For female friendship, I obviously recommend listening first to define gravity and then for good. I think this is a very obvious one. If you have these two next to each other, it's really a beautiful play with this kind of idea of audible contrast. In terms of love, I would recommend listening to I'm Not That Girl first, and then As Long as You're Mine. Kind of goes from questioning to trusting in love. And for Truths and Lies, I would recommend listening to Every Day More Wicked and No One Mourns the Wicked. Not in the original musical type of way, but in this order. First Every Day More Wicked and then No One Mourns the Wicked, which gives you a little more understanding of these first two narratives and the rivalry that happens during Every Day More Wicked. And then you get more of the narrative and the scapegoating and the indoctrination, almost propaganda, that is going on in Munchkinland during No One Mourns the Wicked. So overall, Wicked manages to use the character of Glinda and her vocal range to mirror the concepts of truths and lies in female vocal usage. And at the same time, Elphaba takes on the role of portraying the female strength, which is allowed to waver and question sometimes, but it always ends on an infamous battle cry. On the whole, I hereby propose, fellow women, that we should all learn to navigate many vocal facets, like the ones of Glinda, and at every day, end every day in an earth-shattering battle cry. Doesn't that sound fun? Okay, I had to mess up the last line. That was almost a given. I don't know if I'll be able to listen to this once. If I make it through this one time and I can actually hit the upload button, I very much hope that somebody will find this interesting, because I certainly did. I was so invested in listening to different Elphabas and different Glindas and how they sing these songs. But of course, the female voice has certain anatomical restrictions. It's different for every woman, and it's different where your register change happens, and it depends, of course, a lot on how well trained your voice is, which most musical singers have very well trained voices. They know how to use it. But that also gives them the freedom to kind of play with this change of vocal register. And I just love how built into the melodies is not just the intervals and the background theory of music that goes into creating a musical and creating these beautiful songs. On top of that, we have the story, and the like cherry on top is the person who wrote this really knew where to place the notes so they would sound a certain way, and so they might say a certain thing about the character in that moment. Placing I don't know, E2 in a Glinda section, I think in this musical, is a very, very determined and like secure choice. They've really made some character decisions in how these women are singing and sounding. And I get it. A lot of musicals do that, but I think the beauty of it is that Wicked is such a female-centric musical that is so unapologetic about, yes, allowing for love and a love relationship to happen, but still it's mainly centered about these two women and their friendship. And that combination makes, I think, the vocal registers and how they aligned the whole piece and the pieces within the huge musical very beautiful. So yeah, I think that's going to be it from me. Thanks for granting me access to your ears here on the Mugcast. You can read more of my writing on Medium under Hannah's Cafe or Hug in a Mug, and you can follow me on Instagram at hugin.amug for more cozy content and updates. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to follow the podcast, share it with a fellow coffee lover. Goodness gracious, I'm losing it. And let me know in the comments which article I should read next. I hope you had a nice cappuccino with this episode, or maybe a vanilla latte as I did today. And I'm sending you a warm hug from my mug to yours all the way from South Korea. Hope to see you soon somewhere on Hannah's Cafe. Bye bye.